the Decepticons. I'm mostly talking about the Decepticons as a group, so I won't be talking about Starscream or Megatron, but don't worry, we'll get to them soon enough. Now, as you all know, the Decepticons are, of course, the bad guys. They're the ones that want to kill the Autobots and destroy anything that gets in their way from world domination. So, for the most part, the Decepticons are as one-noted as bad guys can get, right? Well, not anymore. They did start out just having a big hatred for the Autobots and wanting to destroy anything that gets in their way, but recently they haven't always been this way just for the sake of being plain evil. In more recent years in the comics, the Decepticons have been given a more developed side and even had some backstories as to why they think that what they are doing is right for the survival of Cybertron. Times before the war were harsh, they wanted change, and so they believed that they must conquer for rule and order so that Cybertron and its inhabitants can survive. Technically, you could say base films do sort of go into that, but whenever they kind of did, it was often very rushed and implied in really just 3 completely separate lines.
Is the future of our race not worth a single human life?
This is the victory I promised you so many years ago, where we rebuild Cybertron
Together. Cybertron, you are saved. At last.
Now, don't get me wrong, it's still nice that this certain part of the Decepticons is there at all. However, it's an element that needs to be developed and explored rather than lazily thrown in. And by not helping us get to know them more and thus making them more interesting as part of the stories, they come out as mostly one-dimensional and are given no reason for an average film viewer to care about them. Which is a real shame because some of these guys are really great characters. They should have gone more into Soundwave, who is ever so loyal to Megatron and the Decepticon cause. And instead of those completely new guys, why not have Thundercracker, Blitzwing, and Vortex in that highway chase scene in the 3rd movie? Or better yet, Shockwave, who is one of the most popular but underused characters in the franchise despite having so much potential. I mean, the guy is possibly more powerful than even Megatron, and he bases his actions on logic, which makes him all the more dangerous. Think HAL 9000 in a giant lethal robotic suit. And yet he barely appears here and doesn't say more than 2 lines. And none of them have to do with logic? That's like the Joker without his laugh, or Nurse Ratched without her powerful commanding voice. These are all great examples where we can see the Decepticons both as a group and as individuals, and they barely do anything with them. Now granted, not going deep into the antagonists is something that you're kind of supposed to do from a storytelling standpoint. Most stories are supposed to focus more on the protagonists than the antagonists, because sometimes what makes a good story structurally is how you get less visual development from the antagonists so that the audience can care less about him or her and therefore want to root more for the protagonist. But what Michael Bay, the writers, and the other makers of these films don't realize is that the Transformers isn't designed to work that way. Ever since the original cartoon and comics, the Decepticons, both as a group and as individual characters, were given roughly as much character development as the Autobots, because the strength of the Transformers is also from the Decepticons, not just the Autobots on their own just because they're the good guys. That way it gives fans and other people who would want to buy the toys and things like that a bigger variety in choosing both which characters and which sides they like the best. There are people who love the Autobots, but there are just as many people who love the Decepticons. So I guess you could say that not going deep into the Decepticons is kind of okay when we're talking about the first movie, because in that one we're just introducing them as a group. But when you're making sequels, you have to go further into almost everything about the Transformers. And when that sequel has to do with a franchise that gives so many characters to like, both good and evil, that includes giving us a more dimensional side of the Decepticons. Oh sure, no audience member would want a guy who acts that cool to have some development at all.